Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk a little bit about adaptations again. I know, I'm sorry. But what I want to discuss is how we actually approach discussing adaptation. And the reason I want to do this is one of the things that is so important is understanding how we approach a discussion, because by the framing of it, that can lead to focusing on specific aspects. And one of the key, before I talk about adaptations, the key illustration of this is, if you remember back in school, when you were asked about a text and then another text, and you were going to put them in conversation, and the question was always, or one of the questions that you frequently got was compare and contrast. And you go, why do we use these two terms? Compare, look for similarities. Contrast, look for differences. So the question was framed, the first thing that you do is you look for the similarities. You look essentially for the points of connection that both have. You're building it up. Then, and only then, do you look for the points of difference. So why is this important, particularly when it comes to adaptation? I've talked before about this very modern movement that toward the idea that in adaptation, fidelity to text, to the source text, is essentially the most absolutely important aspect. And frequently in online discourse about adaptations, about judging them, about analyzing them, about discussing them, we are continually starting with contrasting the adaptation with the source text. We focus on the differences. We focus on the deviations. And of course, people will say, but people know the source text. They want to know how it differs. But the problem is, because of the emphasis of fidelity to text being this criteria that we use, well, criterion because it's singular, but because we have focused on fidelity to text as being the be all and end all discussion of good adaptation, by focusing on difference, on the contrast first and foremost, we are consistently framing it in a negative way. If we were going to discuss an adaptation and we focused on comparison first, let's list all of the things that it is doing that is very similar to or supportive of elements of the source text, that would be seen as, in the current discourse, a very positive thing. Then we can look at differences, which would be seen as a negative. In effect, you would be creating a balanced analysis. But, and here is, obviously where I differ from a lot of online commenters. For me, the first thing about an adaptation is looking at the story it is telling, because adaptation is taking a source text and developing a new narrative from it. So the first thing is look at the narrative it is developing, judge it on what it is trying to do. And once you have established that, then you can move on to comparison to the source text, because again, with online discourse, this fidelity to text is being seen very much in terms of, if it is faithful, it is good. If it is unfaithful, if it has deviated, it is bad. So then you look at the points of comparison. Then you look at the points of contrast, where it is differing. And then that naturally leads to, you've established what it is doing, you've established where it is similar to the source text, you've established where it differs from the source text, and that naturally leads to a discussion then of how is it working as an adaptation? Is it following thematic aspects, the core aspects? Because this leads us on to a very interesting discussion. If we are focused only on differences, any deviation is a difference, but that is not actually looking at what is a significant change. So if we take something like the Wheel of Time adaptation, which some people feel is highly controversial and has done the dirty on Robert Jordan's text. And we take a point like channeling. And in channeling, one of the things in Jordan's work, which isn't present in the first books, but becomes much more relevant, is the linking of the users of channeling into a chain. And essentially, by this linking, in Jordan's text, what they do is they remove the danger of channeling, because a big thing about channeling is if you are taking in too much magic, if you're channeling too much of this energy, you risk burning out. You can burn out your talent or even kill yourself because you're trying to channel too much energy. But if you create a chain of channelers where they are all linked, and it can happen 2, 3, 4, up to a maximum. But as soon as you've included a chain, it's like putting in a fuse, a trip that can occur that stops the danger of burning out. Now, if we think about that in terms of Jordan's narrative, that produces a slight issue. I'm not going to say problem, but a slight issue with the world building. Because if you are a magic user in that world, and there is a danger that you will use too much magic, you're obviously going to be very, very concerned about how much magic you're using. But if there's a really easy thing of, well, I just get another magic user, we join forces, we link. And that means that we can never channel too much. And also through linking, we actually can channel more than either one of us could singly combined. It actually is an exponential growth, and we can channel a lot more. And as soon as you think of it in those terms, you realize that in Jordan's world, for an organization like the Aes Sedai, surely it would become common practice for no Aes Sedai to work alone. That would be viewed as aberrant because there's a massive danger associated with that, particularly because the Aes Sedai are, in the text, in slight declination. Their power has been reduced. They have fewer numbers. Therefore, every person should be treated as an incredibly valuable resource. So one way of thinking about this would be, if you were part of that institution, how do you safeguard your members? You make it a de facto rule or standard procedure that when you channel, you always do so with another person linked to you, because that means you are not running the risk of burning out your assets. You instill that at a very early stage of development of all of these channelers. You go, always work in at least pairs. And that makes perfect sense. You can understand the logic and the psychology behind that. And then if you do that, it brings in this added dimension of, well, you have to trust the person. So there'd be a strong focus on developing trust and bonds between the members of the Aes Sedai, which then elevates a lot of the political maneuvering and political discourse into something that is actually has deep ramifications. What if you're paired with someone you don't trust? And so all of those issues come to the forefront, and it's a way into developing interesting character conflicts. Then, if we look at what the television show Adaptation did, they changed that. Now, at the time, a lot of people were decrying this as a mistake. They didn't understand the lore. And I strongly disagree with that position, because if we look at the effect of what they changed in the TV show, no longer does linking mean that you cannot burn out. But what it does mean is that the person in control, just as in Jordan's text, has control over the flow of magic through the entire chain. But now people can still burn out. People can still burn out in the chain, which means you have to really, really trust the person you're linking with, because they can get you killed. And that elevates that tension even higher. It removes the slightly problematic or the issue in the world building of, well, why don't the Aes Sedai just always channel in groups? Why don't they always work in pairs or trios or quartets? It there's a massive danger now to surrendering the control of your magic to another person who can get you killed. And that adds a massive dimension to the use of magic. It adds a penalty. It adds a danger to the use of this thing. Whereas in Jordan's work, that aspect of the lore, that aspect of how the magic worked, was such an easy get out clause to remove a lot of the danger of using magic. It adds this additional dramatic tension to the use of magic. And given that we know that for the Wheel of Time, they have employed a number of people who are experts on the actual book series to be advisors to the adaptation. The initial assumption that this has deviated from the book, therefore this is negative, therefore this is a mistake. You can see that chain of logic, and it all begins with the initial assumption of focusing on a difference, viewing that difference as a negative, then making the assumption that this is because they don't understand. And this is one of the issues I'm having with a lot of the discourse in adaptation discussions, because this movement towards assumed fidelity being good without looking at the reason and rationale why a change was made and how it supports elements from the text, that to me causes these problems. That a lot of the discussion about adaptation is inherently negative in its bias when it comes to the adaptation, because we are focusing on difference, not focusing on similarity. But when it comes to the discussion of adaptation, everyone accepts that some changes have to be made. And you would think, if that is your default, if some changes have to be made because you're transferring a story from one medium, which has strengths in certain regards, to a different medium, which has strengths in completely different areas, that how we construct and understand narrative in a long form novel and series is done in one way. How we understand it in a different form, like television that is episodic or serialized, those are significant differences in how we approach storytelling. And therefore, the expectation that it is going to follow the same plot as the novels, plot, obviously, here I mean the sequence of narrative events as they occur, rather than plot as in what happens. So I'm using it very specifically as the sequence of narrative events. Expecting that a television show is going to follow the same plot of a novel is an assumption that needs to be challenged, because in order to tell the same thing, even if it is trying to remain absolutely as faithfully as possible to the source text, in trying to tell the same plot, it has to deviate from plot elements in the book because it is a different narrative form. And if we focus on, oh, look, in this episode, they said, and say, this is what they said, this is different from the text, we are immediately focusing on difference instead of taking the same event and go, in the show, they show this thing. This corresponds to this element from the text. However, it has deviated in these regards, that you can see how even the simple framing of the discussion in terms of comparison first, then contrast, can lead to a slightly more nuanced and balanced discussion of what is happening. And in particular, if we discuss what the television show has done in terms of adaptation, what it is doing with it, what message, themes, constructs it is building on, then we look at how that corresponds to similar things within the source text. Then we look at the differences. You can see that creates a much more cohesive, coherent, and rounded approach to the discussion. But initially framing it in terms of, they said this is different to this. is immediately framing the discourse in negative terminology. And that can lead us down this road of assuming change is wrong or change is a mistake. Now, I am a huge Tolkien fan. I love J.R. Tolkien's work, and The Rings of Power has come under a lot of criticism for deviating. How dare they? Deviating from what Tolkien said. And this is especially true for a sequence in episode 5, where there was a discussion of an apocryphal tale about the construct and where Mithril came from. Now, there are a couple of really big points to understand here. Firstly, this information is directly addressed as apocryphal. The show cannot be more specific about the fact that this is not true. This is something that has been bandied around to explain where Mithril comes from. But it is not under any circumstance saying this is where Mithril comes from. It is all in that word, apocryphal. And yet a lot of the conversation about this is, they have said that Mithril comes from here and this is deviated. You go, they specifically said it's not true. They have specifically said it is a folk belief that doesn't have a basis in the diegetic reality. And yet despite that, people are doing a surface reading, ignoring the word apocryphal and saying, they have said that this is where Mithril comes from. Secondly, on this point about the apocryphal story about the creation of Mithril, it is clearly framed as a creation myth. The elf involved is not named. The Balrog involved is not named. And in fact, they have a conflict over a tree, and they do so not by fighting each other, but by the elf pouring the goodness and light of the elf into the tree, and the Balrog pouring darkness and flame into the tree. This is told entirely in symbolic language, and yet a lot of the commenters have been focused on, but that's not what happens. That never happened. Why have they included it? Again, ignoring the fact that it has been described specifically and very clearly as apocryphal, and that this story is recounted in symbolic terms, mythological terms, folkloric terms. It is not meant to be viewed as literal. That is clear in how it has been framed before we hear the information, that the fact that the information has been framed in clearly non-realist terms. And even then, despite all of this being absolutely overt in the adaptation, but this deviates from the text. And this gets us into very murky waters. People keep returning to the Silmarillion as the text that this is deviated from. The Rings of Power adaptation is based on the rights of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all attendant appendices and information contained in those two texts. It is not an adaptation of the Silmarillion. That, in fact, the definitive version of what we have, of what Tolkien intended about the mythology of Middle-earth, if we're going to be true purists about it, has to come from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, because that was what Tolkien authored and published. Everything else are background notes subject to change, and that we know changed radically over time. And the unfinished tales, the histories of Middle-earth, again, based on notes that, as we see, are contradictory. But all of those things published posthumously after Tolkien's demise, all of those things are subject to the editorial oversight, and this is going to sound pejorative, interference. And by that I mean Christopher Tolkien, as an editor, went in and he chose between different elements that Tolkien had written over numerous years. If we are viewing the Silmarillion as a definitive text, we are actually discounting all of the other variants that were written at various times. And in fact, the Silmarillion does not make it clear in the majority of the editions of it when that particular version that Christopher Tolkien included was written. We don't know if that was ever superseded by what was in The Lord of the Rings, because quite often we have a bias thinking the Silmarillion was published later, therefore it is the most definitive version of these things. And it's the most common version that we are familiar with. But the Histories of Middle-earth and all of those other publications that have been assembled and created post Tolkien's passing, while we may think because they are later publications, they are much like in legal terms, they have created a new precedent, they are not definitive. The only thing that is definitive that is Tolkien's vision is The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Everything else are musings that Tolkien had not decided on a definitive version of yet, and we don't even know the sequence of when these were done unless you go into a lot of the archives and research about when he changed the different aspects of the first age and the second age. So the assumption of the Silmarillion having primacy is actually an assumption based on a very shaky foundation. You could just as well say that the primacy is actually in The Lord of the Rings as a published work by the author, and the Silmarillion based on notes that Tolkien did not really intend to see the light of day until he had finished them, until he had reorganized them. We never know what Tolkien was going to do with a lot of those things, because we know that within the Silmarillion and in comparison to the Histories of Middle-earth, there are variants between what Tolkien was doing. And there's an additional element to all of this. The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are written as narratives. They are written as stories with a beginning, middle, and end. They are written in a slightly different mode. The Silmarillion, on the other hand, is a sequence of discontiguous, not connected folk tales that are not written in a realist form. They are written mythologically. They are not necessarily meant to be understood as realist fiction, as defining exactly what happened. That they may have, should Tolkien have remained with us for a lot longer, he may have found ways to narrativize those elements very specifically into something closer to a definitive narrative form like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But as it stands, these were fragments, these were self-contained fragments written as mythology, not as realist fiction, not in that realist form of I'm creating a solid diegesis and creating a world that makes sense. And like one of the easiest illustrations of this is to think that the world of Tolkien's Legendarium was initially flat, but then it becomes a globe. And yet, how does that happen? How do you actually account for that? What, if you were alive at that time, as a number of the elves were, did the world shake? How was this accomplished? It is told in mythological terms. It is not told as a sort of de facto reality. And again, the focusing on the Silmarillion, it gives us insight into the histories of Middle-earth. It gives us insight into all of these different things that Tolkien was doing. I strongly recommend reading it. But these are not the definitive, this is what happened. And we know this for a number of different reasons. One, it is all fiction. None of it ever happened. Two, the Silmarillion is written in mythic terms, not realist terms, not in an attempt to create an extant reality. It is written in a lot of symbolic language. Number three, Tolkien had not finalized a lot of this information. And even when individual tales within the Silmarillion he felt were finalized, they had not been integrated into an extant world history. They fit as episodes that were not connected. And so all of this is to say, it is insightful to look at different ways of exploring and telling the story, but to insist that the Silmarillion is right and the Rings of Power is wrong is ignoring a lot of information and is privileging the Silmarillion to a position that it does not necessarily actually have. Because what makes the Silmarillion more real than all of the various histories and other posthumous texts? Why is it viewed as the definitive version of these events? And why not what is mentioned in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings? And it's because familiarity with the Silmarillion, because it does have a section about the Second Age. It does have details of this, but so much of it is left blank. So much of it is inference. So much of it was not covered by Tolkien that what we've ended up doing is we have interpreted the information from the Silmarillion. We have created what is commonly called a head canon. We have mapped out how characters from the First Age transitioned to the end of the Third Age, the stuff that we are really familiar with that was actually detailed. We've traced that all out. We've created a head canon, and we cannot step back from that. We cannot see that our head canon of how this stuff was created is only one interpretation, and it's making a number of assumptions about the type of narrative it is. We have assumed that the Silmarillion is of the same type as The Lord of the Rings, that these mentions of things in the history of Middle-earth and Valinor, that these are of the same type as what is detailed in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, even though they are specifically framed as mythological. They are specifically framed as stories. They are specifically framed in that mythological, abstract, quite frequently, notion of what happened. Or some of the elements are contradictory, depending on the different sources. And all of this was compiled by Christopher Tolkien, not by J.R. Tolkien himself. And so it is difficult to know which was the definitive version. This might be the more cohesive version, or the version that Christopher Tolkien thought was better or more representative. But we don't know that definitively. And assuming it is definitive is making an assumption. It is not fact. So, to bring this all to a close, essentially, when we are thinking and discussing adaptation, I think the strongest way and most informative way to think about adaptation is think about what the adaptation is doing first. What is being shown? How is it being shown? How is it addressing different themes? What aspects are emerging from the adaptation? Then compare that to the various source materials. Think about how it is doing the things that are from the source material. Then, and only then, move on to, well, now let's think about the differences. And once we have done that, we get a much more comprehensive picture of what the adaptation is doing, and therefore can actually get a better insight into the adaptation. And if we start by focusing on negatives, by focusing on difference, and difference being framed as a negative, we are actually hamstringing our understanding not only of the adaptation, but also we are over-privileging the source material as definitive, as this is how the story must or should be told, when we already know from the very beginning adaptations must necessarily depart from the source material in some regards. We throw that consideration out the window because we go, look at this difference, and we're not considering why the difference is there or how it is a different articulation of something that was in the source material. We're overly focused on surface level similarity. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.